Hi, good morning and happy Wednesday. So, we are kind of coming to the end of this World War One unit, and you probably have noticed, how can we be at the end of World War One when we haven't actually even talked about how World War One ends? We are going to discuss the end of World War One next week, and it's actually going to be a part of our next and final unit, which is the rise of totalitarianism. And the reason why we're taking the end of World War One into that unit is because for you to truly understand the rise of totalitarianism, you have to understand how the ending of World War One really fuels that rise. And so that's why we're separating it there. But anyways, today we're going to talk about the United States. You might have noticed that so far, the United States is not in World War One. And this is supposed to be a world war. How is the United States not involved? And so your goal for today is to be able to answer this question right here. How did the US become involved in World War One? If you can go and explain it to your younger brother, your younger sister, your mom, or your dad, or your aunt, then you're in a really good place. Go ahead and take out the note taker that I gave to you on Canvas or a separate sheet of paper. Any way that you want to take notes is fine with me. Let's go ahead and get started. So, as you have learned, trench warfare is continuing to ravage the Western Front. And in the Eastern Front, Russia is fighting diligently against Germany. But really, as at this point, there is no clear winner. The Allies are still in a super strong stalemate with the Central Powers, and there's not really seeing a budge on either side. And so one of the things that ends up happening is there's a change in pace to try and take over Germany to focus more on the Ottoman Empire. And this is known as the Gallipoli campaign. And the goal of this is really to take over Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. So I have a map right here. So this is the Ottoman Empire. And Gallipoli is like right over here. It's in this peninsula. And the thought is that if you could get into this peninsula, you'd be able to get to Constantinople, which is right on the coast as well. And you'd be able to take over one of the allies of the Central Powers and block off communication and supplies from them. However, this is a failure. So once again, we're not really seeing much movement from the Allies or the Central Powers. And while this is happening, countries turn their attention to their colonies and start demanding more and more from their colonies. Especially as their own citizens are dying, they decide to use their colonies not only for manpower, but of course for continued support and supplies. And this is when we start to see in 1918 and 1917, a rise in participation from Asian and African troops that are forced to provide support, again, because they are colonies or protectorates or spheres of influence with these strong European nations. Now, while this is also happening, we see that Germany and England are increasing their naval conflicts. Because there is a stalemate on land, the hope is that maybe they'll be able to be dominant and gain control of the seas. And one of the things that England does to try and gain control of the seas is they form a blockade around Germany. Now, I believe we've talked about a blockade, but just in case we haven't, if this is Germany right here, my hand is Germany, a blockade would be setting up boats along the coast of Germany to ensure that no boats can come into Germany and give them supplies, as well as no boats can come out of Germany and spread communication or supplies to their friends. So one more time, a blockade is when you literally block the coast of a country to make sure that no ships can come in and no ships can come out. And what this does is it creates a shortage of all types of supplies, especially food, and it creates further communication issues with countries like Germany and the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary. And it actually works pretty well for England. However, in retaliation, Germany decides to do the exact same thing to England. And England is an island nation, so this is a serious threat. If England, an island, is completely surrounded by Germany, it's going to make it extremely difficult for them to communicate, to get supplies, to help their allies like the French and the Russians. And to make matters worse, Germany has extremely powerful technology and new weapons in the form of what are called U-boats. These U-boats are precursors to submarines. So the U-boats are what comes before submarines. And these U-boats were actually pretty successful because it was difficult for ships to be able to figure out where they were, especially since radio was so new and radar wasn't really established yet. And this ultimately leads to their blockade being the start of what is called, unrestricted submarine warfare. In 1917, they decide to implement unrestricted submarine warfare. And what this means is that Germany has officially said that all ships, if they are around the UK where we are blocking, they will be attacked, they will be sunk, they will be taken over. The reason why this is so problematic is because any ship, not even just a UK ship, but any ship now is a threat. And this is problematic for the United States. This is extremely problematic for the United States because the United States is supposed to be a neutral country. They are not in the war. They are not fighting in this conflict. And so when the United States hears that unrestricted submarine warfare is officially implemented by Germany for UK waters, the United States is like, hey, we send ships to the UK all the time with civilians. Does that mean our civilians are the target? And the answer is yes. Even cruise ships with people just traveling across the Atlantic are now potentially subject to German U-boats. And this isn't actually the first time Germany tried to implement unrestricted submarine warfare. In fact, about a year and a half earlier, in 1915, Germany did exactly that with the sinking of the Lusitania. And so in 1915, the Lusitania was a British cruise ship that was going from the United States into Britain. And there were thousands of people on this ship. And in fact, 1,200 people died, and 128 of those were Americans. And the United States responded by saying, how dare you kill our civilians? You had no right to sink a cruise ship. We're not in war. This was a cruise ship from the United States to England. However, the United States couldn't actually play so innocent. And the reason why they couldn't play so innocent is that there were 4,200 cases of gun cartridges on this cruise ship going into England to help England supply their war effort. And this is where it gets a little dicey because the Americans are right. Those were civilians on that ship. It was absolutely a cruise ship. However, the United States took this cruise ship and without the passengers' knowledge, put gun cartridges, thinking that this was a way to smuggle in supplies to England without Germany knowing. So I want you to take a second right here. It's 1915. It's very early on in the war. And at this point, Is the United States neutral? And I want you to write down your thoughts. Do you have to have a declaration of war in order to no longer be neutral? Or is supplying somebody guns and weapons enough to say that you are no longer neutral? So I'm going to show you, hopefully you've written your own. Do it. Write your thoughts. Pause. Write them down. So I'm going to show you a historian's perspective. Now, this doesn't have to be yours, but I just found his perspective pretty interesting. So this is Howard Zinn. He's a famous historian. He has some really good history books. If you're interested, let me know. And he responds to this question by saying, it was unrealistic to expect that the Germans should treat the United States as neutral in the war when the US had been shipping great amounts of war materials to Germany's enemies. In early 1915, the British liner Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. She sank in 18 minutes, and 1,198 people died, including 124 Americans. The United States claimed the Lusitania carried an innocent cargo, and therefore the torpedoing was a monstrous German atrocity. Actually, the Lusitania was heavily armed. It carried 1,248 cases of 3-inch shells, 4,927 boxes of cartridges, 1,000 rounds in each box, and 2,000 more cases of small arms ammunitions. Her manifests were falsified to hide this fact, and the British and American governments lied about the cargoes. So some historians, like Howard Zinn, say that because the United States was so close to the Allies, supplying them weapons, supplying them bullets, supplying them necessities, they forfeited their right to be neutral. However, in 1915, after the sinking of the Lusitania, the United States does not officially declare war. I repeat, after the sinking of the Lusitania, the United States does not officially declare war against Germany or the Central Powers. Many people falsely say that it's the sinking of the Lusitania that brings the United States in the war, but it's actually another year and a half until the United States joins the war. So let's take a look at what actually does it. So once in 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare is declared, the United States starts to have a major shift in those Americans that support or don't support the war. And these people are known as hawks and doves. The hawks are the ones that want to go to war. They feel insulted by the attack of the Lusitania. They think that unrestricted submarine warfare is atrocious. They've heard about German monstrous acts in Belgium and in France and feel like Germany needs to be stopped. On top of that, they're extremely close with British and French citizens or the government, and they feel like they want to protect American interests. Especially since they're afraid that Germany will eventually encroach on American colonies, like the Philippines, like Puerto Rico, like Guam. If Germany is that power hungry, they're not going to stop at Europe. They're going to keep going to North America. And on the flip side, we have the doves that want to stay out of the war. They feel like this is a European conflict and that the United States has no need, no desire, no justification to actually enter into this war over the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Come on, how does the United States have anything to do with that? On top of that, the doves typically had ties with the German government. Either they themselves were German or had ancestry that was German, and therefore they felt uncomfortable fighting against a country that they felt a kinship to. And lastly, many doves feared massive casualties. They heard what was happening to British, French, and Russian soldiers and wanted to save American lives. They really felt that there was so much senseless death and injury happening that they wanted to stay out of it. And then what finally happens to kind of push the United States even further into war is known as the Zimmermann Telegram. On January 16th, 1917, Germany sends a telegram to Mexico. And it's a coded telegram. As you can see the picture, you see the numbers because it's encrypted. And basically, Germany tells Mexico, hey, I'm going to offer you a deal. If you attack America, if you go into war with America, we, Germany, will have your back. We will support you if you fight America. And if you fight America, of course we will win. And after we defeat the United States, you can take back all of the land that was conquered by the United States. So this includes New Mexico, Arizona, California, parts of Nevada. It's a huge chunk of land. It's basically the southwestern part of the United States that used to belong to Mexico. However, this telegram is intercepted by British intelligence and translated, they decode it, and give it to the United States. And the British make sure the United States gets this telegram. And the United States sees this telegram, and a lot of people see this as the final straw, the thing that officially pushes the United States into war. But I would like to remind you that this is January 16th, 1917. And very early on, unrestricted submarine warfare happens in 1917 as well. And so officially, on April 2nd, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany and sides with the Allies in World War I. I want you to take a second and brainstorm what advantages my US soldiers bring to the Allies. Pause the video and just bullet point some things that would be helpful about having US allies, US soldiers, Pause. Do it. Pause. Please. 2 seconds. Okay. So first thing that you should understand is the supplies. The United States brings a strong economy that has a strong factory network as well as a strong agricultural background to provide food, weapons, clothing, first aid, transportation. On top of that, new soldiers means more manpower. So while this is really helpful, there's 2 things I want to point out. 1, the United States is not in the war for that long. Okay. And 2, the United States manpower-wise really only helps the Western Front. And this is going to be extremely important in the future. I repeat, the United States really only helps the Western Front. And if you're wondering why, feel free to Google it or wait a couple of weeks when we start to talk about Russia. On top of that, they bring new leadership, new strategies, new military advisors into this conflict. They also bring medical support. Women come as nurses. There are doctors that are flown to Europe, new hospitals that are created because of the United States. And of course, there's a resurgence of energy. France and British troops have been fighting nonstop for years now and are exhausted. So having the United States revamps the energy, gives the soldiers this hope that they'll actually be able to fight and win in this conflict. So the last thing that I want you to do in your own words, I want you to describe why the United States joined the war. Now I'm going to give you a hint. The answer is not as simple as just saying the United States joined because of blank, period, done. So pause and take a couple of seconds to write down a few sentences of why the United States joined World War I. And of course, it's not the sinking of the Lusitania. Did you do it? Did you pause? Okay, so for this answer, I'm specifically looking for two things. One, I'm looking for you to mention the Zimmerman telegram. However, the bigger and badder thing really is the unrestricted submarine warfare, because it's this unrestricted submarine warfare that convinces many Americans to side with the Hawks and really shows that Germany is not going to stop, that Germany is willing to attack civilians, and that Germany is willing to win this war at all costs. So hopefully you wrote both of those reasons. Now, when the United States joins the war, as well as before, there are a couple of things that I want to point out before I finish this lecture. And one is that World War I is a prime example of what is known as total war, which is when all parts of an economy are dedicated to the war effort. So you're not going to be making sweaters for civilians or tables for civilians. Instead, your factories are going to be focused on helping the war effort. So this means that if you were a factory that used to make toasters, now you're a factory that makes bullets. And we see this in Britain, France, Russia, even the United States. We start to see their economies and all of their government focus on the war effort. And an example of this is the fact that it's the government that actually declares what is produced and how much of it. So during times of war, the government becomes much more hands-on in the economy. We actually start to see the governments forcing factories to stop what they're doing and produce weapons for the war effort. But this kind of creates an interesting question, which is, does this mean that civilians are truly civilians? Does total war make every single person now a quote unquote soldier? And does attacking a factory that creates weapons count as breaking the rules of war because you're killing civilians? And honestly, this line gets really blurred and is broken by both sides, the Allies and the Central Powers. Both sides attack civilian industrial centers because it's those centers that are building boats and U-ships and guns and tanks. And so I don't have an answer for you, but this question will come back in future wars as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is the home front. And not just the American home front, but the home front throughout Europe as well. And that's that most civilians, all civilians at this time, are participating in somewhat extreme rationing, especially places like Russia, where most of the food is going to soldiers who need a high calorie count because they're working out so much. They're moving heavy machinery. And so civilians are put on a strict rationing schedule, meaning like there are certain days where they have no wheat or certain days where they can't have any meat. And this is to make sure that a majority of the food and resources go to the soldiers. And rationing doesn't just apply to food, it's also things like oil. So Americans are told to use less oil so that they can be used for weaponry and machines. And then, of course, one of the reasons to get civilians to engage in such intense rationing is by participating in spreading propaganda. So really making sure that every civilian feels like this patriotic and moral duty to do what they can to ensure that soldiers are supported and have enough supplies. And then the last thing that I want to mention before we're done with this lecture is the fact that women start entering the workforce as men are deployed. Now, we like to think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II as like the start of this, as the person who's really bringing women into the workforce. But the reality is that in World War I, women do the exact same thing. There's just not a catchy, we can do it, Rosie the Riveter propaganda for it. But women absolutely enter factory life. They help as nurses, they go to hospitals. Women are in charge of running their countries, running their households until their husbands, fathers, brothers come back home. And so a lot of the weight of running the country is left to women in the home front. Well, that's all I have for you today. Again, your goal is to truly be able to answer this question. Submit your notes onto the assignments link when you are done. And I hope you have a fabulous Wednesday. I miss you all terribly. And of course, you are taking your World War I assessment today. So good luck with that. It's open note. I'm not worried. Use all of the resources you have at your disposal, and good luck.